Well, today we're going to follow on where we left off last year, and we're going to have a look at exposures over this next semester and explore beyond the colour and tone that we did last year. So just covering off on where we've been for the last 2 years is we've been on a journey to discover what an engaging image means. We all want to have a photo that stops people in their tracks. And the key aspects of what stops people in their tracks are a photograph that the image is aesthetically pleasing. It just is pleasurable to look at. The emotive narrative may sometimes make it a bit disarming. It may be something that's quite dark and sinister, or it might be really light and joyful. But those two aspects of visually pleasing and having some emotional engagement in an image helps that image become engaging. The other thing that makes a good image is the timing. And the timing comes about, say perhaps with a pose when you're taking a portrait photo, that you've just captured the essence of that person in that split second that you took it. Or it may be timing in a sports photography, or timing in terms of a landscape photography and the lighting. So those three aspects are the key components that give us an engaging image. And the next level down of how do we support those three aspects are choosing a subject that is pleasing, or a subject that is interesting to the viewer, ensuring that our composition contributes to the aesthetically pleasing and the emotional narrative. And we spent quite a bit of time last year looking at all the aspects of composition that gave that. And then we went into the pleasing, the aesthetic pleasingness of light, and how that affects our emotions as well. And I have always said to you that light is in fact the most important component of a photographic image, because photography is about painting with light. And what light is made up of is colour and tone. And we explored all the different emotive and aesthetically pleasing aspects of different colours last year. And then we moved on to tone. And tone is about the brightness of an image. And we looked at how high key images, ones that are very bright, are quite light and pleasant and pleasing images. Whereas low key images, ones that are much darker in their tones, have a much more sinister overall feeling in their narrative. It doesn't make them bad, because they can be really quite interesting photographs. So when we were looking at tone, one of the homework exercises I gave you was to go away and ensure that on your camera you could get your histogram up, because we can't really look at tone in the back screens of our camera when we're out in the bright sunlight. What it's showing you as the picture is not terribly useful. You really need to look at the histogram. And the histogram is a quantitative representation of the relative tones in an image. And what it does is it's a bit like perhaps a ECT of your heart, which gives the doctor a quantitative graph of how well your heart is operating. That's what your histogram does in your camera. It's a quantitative evaluation of how the tones are spread within your image. And it's something that you need to become very conversant with reading. So that takes us on to exposure, because in order to get those tones right, you need to control exposure. And that's what we're going to be doing for this semester, is teaching you how to control exposure. So what do we mean by exposure? Well, your camera sensor, which all our digital cameras come with a sensor that collects and captures the light. And these sensors have like little buckets in them, and the little buckets capture the light photons, as they come into your lens, these sensor buckets capture them. And as they come into your lens, they come in as red, green, and blue light. And they're captured and recorded as such. The more light that comes in, the more little of those coloured balls that drop onto your sensor, the brighter the light is in your histogram. So what do we mean by an overexposed image? Now, we saw before really bright images and really dark images, and they were exposed properly. But sometimes we get overexposure, where certain parts of our image, which should have colour in them, are just bright white light. And you can see here, this whole region is bright and glaring, and we can see no texture in it whatsoever. Often people say to me when something isn't exposed properly in their camera, oh, don't worry, I'll fix it in Photoshop later. When something is overexposed, you can't fix it later. When you try and bring down your exposures, you end up with these muddy grey blotches in your image, and it's terrible. And particularly with skin, like at the moment you can see some of my skin is very highly exposed. I've got bright spots on it. If you try and pull that down, I'll try and sort of get brighter, there we are. If you try and pull that down in editing, you end up with big grey splodges on you. So it's really important that we get this right in camera. The other end of the spectrum is when we underexpose an image. And when we underexpose an image, we get what we call muddy, dark, burnt out areas in our image, that they're impossible to see. And yes, we can pull them back up using editing software, but we often end up with what we call colour aberrations. And I know with the first time someone said to me about colour aberrations, I had no idea what they were talking about. It looked okay to me. But when you actually go into the image, you see this. This was a photo I took yesterday. This is a cropped version of the photo. And this is it. The same cropped version, underexposed, was completely black. The flash didn't go off. This is it when the flash went off. And when I try and bring this one up using editing software, this is what I get, where all the pixels in the image just are any which colour. They're just grainy and noisy and really ugly looking. So it's not a solution to think, oh, it doesn't matter, I'll just let the camera take whatever it takes and I'll just fix it later. You end up with photographs that just don't work. And particularly if you take one of these photographs, you drag up the exposures and then you decide to print it, you'll see this in your print instead of seeing this. So this was then adjusted. I originally took the photo that was underexposed and overexposed, and then I took a correct exposure, and this is what I got. So it's really important, if you're thinking of ever printing your photographs or blowing them up on a screen, that they are correctly exposed. And so that exposure may be very light photographs, as we saw with the high key, or very dark photographs that we saw with the low key, or they may be just medium exposed photographs. But what we've got to learn to do is to know when they have been overexposed, underexposed, and when they're correctly exposed. So again, this is just an example of what happens when you try and drag something out of the shadows. We end up with very grainy and incorrectly coloured photographs. All the edges are soft. You can't get a sharp photo because your camera can't record the detail enough to get that contrast at the edges. So what we're going to have a look today is how do we check exposure, and why can't we just tell it to take the right exposure, or why can't we get it to do the right exposure? And the reason is that our cameras at the moment just haven't got the same capability to see as we can see. That we can see all of this in our human vision, and our camera can only see what we call 12 stops. So in our human vision, we can see anything up to 20 stops of light, from the very brightest white to the very darkest dark. And so that's about 15 to 20 stops. And our camera can only see 12. And each tonal step is what is called a stop in photography. So this is the tonal range of what we can see. And so we go out there and we see all of this. And then we say to the camera, with your automatic way of capturing it, you capture what you think we'll want to see. And the camera goes, well, which one? Do I go up here, or do I go down here, or do I do the middle, if this is the scene? So this is our reality. This is what the camera can take. But it could take this lot. It could decide to take this lot. It could take this lot, this lot, this lot. When we shoot on automatic, we're letting the camera go, oh, God, I don't know what she wants. I'll give it a go at this. And we get it and we go, oh, it's not what I wanted. So this is why we need to control exposure, so that we choose, for this particular shot, I'd like to get these 12 stops, and that's my high key. Or for this particular shot, I'd like to get these stops, and that's my low key photograph. Or for this particular photograph, I'd like to have just the tones in the middle. So that's why we need to control exposure. So when we're talking about dynamic range, I'll just go back. The dynamic range of what we see is the full gambit, from the pure whites to the pure blacks are our dynamic range of our scene. And that's why I said to you at our last week's workshop, this is a horrific day to take photographs, because this was our dynamic range last week. The best days are the cloudy days, where you only have 12 stops of dynamic range. And then your camera can work really well to automatically capture those stops and not blow something out or have really dark spots. So dynamic range is from the very darkest to the very lightest. The dynamic range of a scene often well exceeds what the dynamic range of your camera is. And at that point, we need to have control over the exposures of our camera. And we can't check whether we've got the right exposures by looking at the back of the camera's viewfinder that shows us what we've just photographed, because it's like taking a television outside in the bright sunlight and expecting to see what it would look like in a normal room. You just can't see it. It just doesn't work. You have to look at the graph, and the graph is our histogram. So we're going to just talk a little bit about this histogram, and for your homework, you're going to also go back and make sure that you can see it on your camera. I have it showing every single shot I take. When I'm in a hurry, I can't investigate every aspect of the photo, even if I'm under correct light, to see if it's being exposed correctly. The histogram immediately tells me that. So when we're reading a histogram, the x-axis takes us from the pure black to the pure white. That's the histogram of our image. It may not be the histogram of our scene, but it's a histogram of our image. And so the y-axis tells us how many pixels in that photograph actually have that characteristic. So if you convert that monotone graph down to something that actually gives us all the shades of from white through to pure black, you can see down here, the pure whites, we only have a very few of them. The pale greys, not many compared to what we've got from the dark charcoals. So this is how we read it. The height is how many pixels in your photograph are like that. And sometimes we may have some pure blacks that we know that we're not going to be able to see, but there's so few pixels. They're right down here, and there's so few pixels that are pure black, it doesn't matter. Or so few pure pixels are pure white, it doesn't matter. So for most photographs, we aim to try and get this spread across the sort of an even spread across the histogram. And so this photo is just showing you one that's got an even spread. This is where our pure whites would have no texture, and this is where our pure blacks would have no colours and just be pure black. It's interesting that we've got that spread of tone, because when you actually look at the image, because it's in colour, we think, oh, it's all the one colour. It's all the one colour, but it has this whole gambit of different tones. And as soon as we turn it to black and white, you can see all the different tones in the image. And so this is what you look at in the back of the camera. Very hard to see what's been exposed and what hasn't, and are you using all of your available sensor. So reading the histogram and taking this photograph, there's too many bright whites and too many pure blacks. And so when I turn it to black and white, you can see all of these pure blacks. I can see no texture, nothing in them. They just turn to pure black. And the pure whites in the sky are up here. And again, they're blown out. If I try and bring them back, if I try and bring this pure black, pure white back, it will end up a really muddy grey. In this scene, it looked like it had a really high dynamic range, but the day was dull enough for me to be able to capture it all on the sensor. And you can see here, I haven't blown out my whites, and I haven't blown out or made my blacks too dark. So if I bring this up in post, I can still get all the detail in this dark door here, and my clouds still have texture in them, even though they're pure white. So this immediately shows me in the back of the camera, I have exposed this correctly. I don't have to readjust my camera. Again, that a black swan against a muddy dark background is not an easy exposure to do. And yes, most of the image is charcoal greys and dark muddy browns. And so my histogram's showing that. I have got some really quite black areas down here, but you can see the detail. I can actually see the detail in those feathers, but the swan was pure black. So this is all I can expect to get. But these highlights in the front of the feather and the whites in the beak are what I'm seeing up here. So all these highlights showing up with the sunlight are all the light colours that I'm getting up here. So I can check my histogram and check that it's exposed correctly, because this was a hard one to expose for, because if I increase my exposure, all of these feathers would blow out. They'd just be bright, way too light. And if I decreased it so I'd stop that, then I'd lose all the detail. So it was a balancing act with that image. So manipulating the brightness in our camera, we are going to spend the rest of this semester to know how to do this. So when we look at the histogram, when we're taking photographs and we go, that's overexposed or that's underexposed, what do I need to do with my camera? If we overexpose an image, it's called clipping it, and we clip it on the right-hand side where all the whites are, and we can't bring it back. Once we've clipped, we can't bring those whites back. Too little light, we clip on the left-hand side. So I showed you in those histograms, these are what are called our goal posts. What you try and do is don't hit your goalposts. You try and stay within the boundaries. You can have it right up here, your histogram right up this end, just don't hit the goalpost, and you can have it right down this end, just don't hit the goalpost. So that's what we're aiming for in our exposures. And so In this one here, it was way too bright. This was the same Lake Wendouree. And you can see there's no details in the whites whatsoever because I hit the goalpost. This one, there's no details in the darks. All down here is just this muddy blackness. So I've hit the goalpost here and I've got no pixels that have captured correctly up the light end. And this is my even exposure where I've captured all the light greys, dark greys, pure whites, blacks. Everything has been collected on my sensor. And once everything's collected on your sensor and doesn't hit the goalposts, you can do whatever you like with this image in your editing software. It will sustain really aggressive editing. The moment you try and put aggressive editing on an underexposure or an overexposure, then you will start to see the image starts to break down into color aberrations and a muddy, blurry image. So they're the histograms that say underexposed, nothing down here. No light greys, medium greys, no whites, no highlights. This is exposed to the left, and it's exposed, like you'll be able to pull this back in post because we haven't hit this goalpost, but it is underexposed because we haven't got any pure whites showing. And it's a very unusual scene that there isn't a pure white in, just like it's an unusual scene that there isn't a pure black. So we usually expect, even if it's only just a few pixels in the pure black or a few pixels in the pure white, we still expect some. So this is what we call a neutral exposure. This is the same scene that has been exposed differently in the camera. This one is what we call exposed to the right. Now this one shows us that we can still pull it a little bit to the right in our exposure. And I'm going to teach you about exposing to the right because your sensor exponentially more sensitive as we get up to this end of the spectrum. And we can do more editing if we expose to the right, but we've got to be very careful not to hit that goalpost. And this one is overexposed. So why is it important? Well, if we allow a camera to choose its own exposures, it says, I'll choose whatever 12 stops I want. And they're not necessarily the 12 stops you wanted. So we need to know how to control our camera so that we get our whites and our pure blacks, but we don't allow them to hit the goalposts. And we need to know how to set our cameras to do that. So this is to show you what my camera automatically did when I was trying to photograph this spider. It way overexposed my spider, and my background's looking pretty ordinary too, but at least it exposed it as well as it could. This is me saying, you know what, I'm going to expose for that spider and I want my background to go as dark as it likes to go, because I know that web and that spider, if I control my camera, I can get it perfectly exposed, and I like that pure black background. So that's what I want, and that allows you, for all of those photographs that you never get what you want, to actually get what you want. So that brings us to our homework. I want you to have a look at some of your previously really underexposed photos and overexposed photos, and have a look what happens when you drag them up and drag them in your editing software, how it starts to degrade the photograph. And I want you to have a look, particularly for the very underexposed ones. If you really drag that exposure up, what happens to the color and the detail in those photos in terms of the edges becoming all fuzzy. So that I'm trying to convince you that you can't just go, don't worry, I'll fix it in Photoshop. You will never fix it in Photoshop. You really need to learn how to use your camera so you get it right in the first place. Okay, so that's the end of today, and your homework is make sure that you get that histogram up in your camera and you know what it looks like. If you use an iPhone, just try and manage your exposures by Karen will teach you how to take them up and down if they don't look right. And the other is to have a look at editing some of those photos that you've ruined in the past and what happens when you do actually edit them. So thank you for today.